Hi, I'm Patty with Amplify Science. I'm going to lead you through this unit orientation video for the second grade unit, Changing Landforms. In Changing Landforms, students work as geologists, investigating landforms and erosion to figure out the anchor phenomenon in their unit. They will be advising the director of the Oceanside Recreation Center about whether or not he should keep the center open, even though the cliff by the center is changing. The director of the Oceanside Rec Center got a scare when a nearby cliff collapsed, and he's worried about whether that has safety implications for the rec center. Historical information and data show that where the rec center sits seems to be receding. So students help investigate using models that allow them to generate and explore questions about wind and water changing landforms. Books introduce students to important concepts about different types of landforms and the process of erosion, and a digital modeling tool allows students to make sense of these concepts throughout the unit. At the end of the unit, students consider a new anchor phenomenon to explain why the nearby cliff eroded overnight, and they use this information to discuss whether the same thing could happen to the recreation center's cliff. As they work through the 4 chapters, they gather evidence from multiple sources by doing, talking, reading, writing, and visualizing. Their explanations become more complex over time as they construct understanding about how rock and landforms can change, both very slowly over time and more quickly in some situations. This unit is a modeling unit. In their role as geologists, students develop skills in using all 8 of the science and engineering practices, but they particularly focus on developing and using models as they construct explanations in this unit. They receive explicit instruction and opportunities to practice using and creating models as they use physical models to gather evidence about the process of erosion. They learn about diagrams and maps as models, learning to interpret them and gather evidence from them. And then they create diagram models to show their understanding of the process and results of erosion. The focal cross-cutting concept in this unit is scale, proportion, and quantity. In their role as geologists, students delve deeply into the scale of changes to landforms, both in terms of time scale and spatial scale. As students begin to understand how erosion happens, they can explain how tiny changes can add up over very long periods of time to cause larger changes, and how the speed of changes can vary depending on the composition of landforms. Every Amplify Science elementary unit also includes a focal sense-making strategy, which students leverage as they read and also during investigations. This unit sense-making strategy is visualization. Units in Amplify Science K-5 have a main writing genre, and like most units in the elementary grades, it is writing scientific explanations in this Changing Landforms unit. Well, that's the overview. Now I'll talk you through what happens throughout the unit and how students build from their prior knowledge to get to a complex causal explanation of the anchor phenomenon. To do this, I'll summarize the key ideas students figure out in each chapter and how they use these ideas to explain the anchor phenomenon piece by piece. For each chapter, I'll highlight 1 or 2 key evidence sources students use. But remember, in every chapter, and indeed every lesson, students gather evidence multimodally from many different sources. In Chapter 1, students investigate the question, how did the edge of the cliff get to be so close to the flagpole? And they learn that landforms can change. Key evidence sources include information gained from reading Gary's Sand Journal. They observe mystery sand, and they use evidence from those observations of sand samples as evidence for how the sand got to be the way it is, breaking down from larger rocks. At the end of Chapter 1, students return to the anchor phenomenon. They explain that the shape of the cliff changed when the rock it is made of changed. Landforms are made of rock, and rock can change. In Chapter 2, students try to figure out how the recreation center's cliff changed. In this chapter, students use a chalk model to gather evidence about how water changes landforms. This data helps them discuss how water can change the shape of a landform. Then they create and share diagrams of landform change. At the end of chapter 2, students are able to explain water hit the cliff and caused tiny pieces of the cliff to break off and move away. In chapter 3, students dig into answering the question, how did the recreation center's cliff erode without the director noticing? As they're presented with evidence that the flagpole is closer to the edge of the ocean cliff than it used to be. Key experiences in this chapter include students reading aloud about how change happens over time in the Handbook of Land and Water, and writing about how small changes over time can accumulate to create a big change. At the end of chapter 3, students are able to explain that because the pieces are so small, it took a really long time to observe a big change in the cliff. We can't see landform change in front of us. It takes a long time for the landform to change shape because the pieces that break off are so small. When enough tiny pieces of the landform break off, the landform changes enough that we can observe that change. In the final chapter of the unit, students work to solve the problem of figuring out how a nearby cliff could have eroded overnight. In this chapter, a key experience involves students collecting evidence using a digital modeling tool. They look at the rate of erosion between different landforms, coming to understand that wind and water can erode a landform quickly if the landform is made of loose materials. By the conclusion of chapter 4, students will be able to explain that the nearby cliff eroded quickly because it's made of loose materials such as clay and dirt, which are not as strong as rock. When wind or water hits the cliff, big pieces can break off. This causes the cliff to change more quickly than rock would. I hope you're feeling excited to start teaching this unit. In addition to the lessons and the unit resources on the Amplify platform, check out the at-home videos and the at-home unit for changing landforms. The Spanish at-home unit will be posted March 6th. You can use any combination of these resources to engage your students in figuring out about changing landforms. Additionally, in March, we'll be posting a video session that will help you learn more about the progress build and the embedded assessments within the platform unit lessons. There are many formative assessments to help you make sure you know right where your students are with concept development as you move through the lessons. Please let me know how I can help you plan for instruction. I'm Patty Works, and my email address is pworks@amplify.com. Thanks for listening.